The year was 1868, and Washington, D.C. was about to explode with scandal. A book hit the shelves that would shake the nation to its core. Not written by a politician, not by a general, but by a woman who had spent 50 years keeping the darkest secrets of America's most beloved president. Her name was Elizabeth Keckley, and she had seen everything. She had dressed Mary Todd Lincoln in the White House. She had consoled the First Lady after President Lincoln's assassination. She had witnessed private breakdowns, heard whispered confessions, and stood silently in rooms where history was made. For decades, she kept her mouth shut. But now, the secrets were out, and America would never look at the Lincoln family the same way again. How does a woman born into slavery end up as the keeper of presidential secrets? What did she see behind those closed White House doors that haunted her for half a century? And why, after staying silent for so long, did she finally decide to tell the truth, knowing it would destroy everything she had built? Before we uncover the shocking revelations that ended Elizabeth's life in poverty and disgrace, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story gets darker than you can imagine. This is the untold story of Elizabeth Keckley, the slave who became Lincoln's dressmaker, and the 50-year burden of secrets she carried to her grave. Elizabeth Hobbs was born in 1818 on a plantation in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, and from the moment she took her first breath, she belonged to someone else. Her mother, Agnes, was a slave owned by Colonel Armistead Burwell, and her father, George Pleasant Hobbs, was a slave on a neighboring plantation. Elizabeth would barely know her father, because slave owners didn't care about families. They separated parents from children, like they were dividing up furniture. By the time Elizabeth was 4 years old, she was already working, not playing with dolls or learning to read, but working. Her first job was taking care of the Burwell family's baby, a child who cried constantly through the night. Elizabeth was expected to keep that baby quiet, calm, and happy at all times. But she was 4 years old herself. She didn't know how to handle a screaming infant. One night, when the baby wouldn't stop crying, Mrs. Burwell stormed into the room in a rage. She grabbed Elizabeth by the arm, dragged her outside, and whipped her with a rawhide strap until her back bled. Elizabeth was 4 years old, and she learned that night that mercy didn't exist in her world. As she grew older, the abuse only got worse. When Elizabeth turned 14, Colonel Burwell decided she was old enough to be loaned out to his son, who had moved to North Carolina and needed household help. She was sent away from her mother, away from everything she knew, and handed over to a man named William Burwell and his wife. They treated Elizabeth like she was less than human. She cooked, cleaned, sewed, and worked from sunrise to long after sunset. But that wasn't the worst part. William Burwell's friend, a white man named Alexander Kirkland, took an interest in Elizabeth. She tried to avoid him, tried to stay out of his sight, but in 1839, when she was around 18 years old, Kirkland forced himself on her. She had no rights, no voice, no protection. Nobody cared what happened to a slave girl. Elizabeth became pregnant, and 9 months later, she gave birth to a son she named George. She loved that boy with everything she had, but every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the violence that brought him into the world. Elizabeth was eventually sent back to Virginia, but the trauma stayed with her. Her masters continued to work her like a machine, never once acknowledging the pain she carried. She was beaten, humiliated, and told repeatedly that she was nothing, but something inside Elizabeth refused to break. While other slaves around her gave up hope, Elizabeth held on to a single thought that kept her alive. One day, she would be free. She started learning how to sew with more skill than anyone around her. She watched how the white women wore their dresses, how the seams were stitched, how the fabric draped. She became so good at dressmaking that wealthy women in the area started requesting her work. They didn't care that she was a slave. They just wanted the best seamstress available, and that was Elizabeth. She began making money on the side, tiny amounts at first, but it was something. It was the beginning of a plan that seemed impossible, a dream that most slaves would never dare to imagine. Elizabeth Keckley wasn't just going to survive. She was going to buy her freedom. By the time Elizabeth was in her 30s, she had been moved again, this time to St. Louis, Missouri, where she lived with her master's daughter, Anne Burwell Garland. Anne's husband had died, leaving the family drowning in debt, and suddenly Elizabeth became the only thing keeping them afloat financially. She worked as a dressmaker for the wealthiest women in St. Louis, and the money she earned went straight into the Garland family's pockets. Elizabeth stitched gowns for high society ladies who attended fancy parties and social events, women who lived lives of luxury while Elizabeth remained in chains. She worked 16-hour days, her fingers cramped and bleeding from pushing needles through thick fabric, but she never complained. Every dress she made, every stitch she completed, was another step toward the impossible dream she carried in her heart. She wanted to be free, and she wanted her son George to be free. But freedom wasn't given to slaves. It had to be bought, and the price was crushing. In 1855, Elizabeth approached Anne Garland with a proposal that took incredible courage. She asked to purchase her freedom and her son's freedom for $1,200. In today's money, that would be worth over $40,000. For a slave woman who earned nothing for herself, who had spent her entire life making money for white families, $1,200 might as well have been $1 million. Anne Garland agreed to the deal, but she didn't believe Elizabeth could ever raise that kind of money. She probably thought Elizabeth would try for a few months, fail, and give up like so many others had before her. But Anne Garland didn't know Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth didn't just work harder, she worked smarter. She went to the wealthy women she had been sewing for and explained her situation. She told them she needed to raise $1,200 to buy her freedom, and she asked if they would help her by lending money or paying her in advance for dresses. Some of these women had watched Elizabeth work for years. They had seen her skill, her dedication, her quiet dignity, even in the worst circumstances. They knew she was trustworthy, and slowly, they began to help. One woman lent her $200. Another paid $300 up front for several dresses. Elizabeth kept a careful record of every penny, every debt, every promise she made to pay people back. She worked day and night without rest, taking on more clients than seemed humanly possible. She sewed dresses for weddings, for balls, for events she would never be invited to attend. Her fingers bled, her back ached, her eyes strained in candlelight, but she didn't stop. Month after month, the amount grew. $500, $800, $1,000. People around her started to believe it might actually happen. Her son George watched his mother sacrifice everything, and he began to understand that freedom wasn't just handed out. It was earned through blood, sweat, and willpower that refused to break. Finally, after months of exhausting work, Elizabeth had done it. She had raised $1,200. She walked into Anne Garland's home, placed the money on the table, and said the words she had dreamed of saying her entire life. She was buying her freedom. On November 13, 1855, Elizabeth Keckley and her son George were legally declared free. She was 37 years old, and for the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. Freedom was supposed to feel like a new beginning, but for Elizabeth, it felt more like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how to survive the fall. She had spent everything she had to buy her liberty, and now she was a free black woman in a country that still didn't see her as equal. She had skills, talent, and determination, but she also had nothing. No home of her own, no savings, and a son to take care of. Most freed slaves stayed in the South, where they knew people, but Elizabeth made a bold decision. She was going to leave St. Louis and head to a city where opportunity might actually exist for someone like her. In 1860, she packed what little she owned and moved to Washington, D.C., a city on the verge of chaos as the nation teetered on the edge of civil war. She arrived with $12 in her pocket and a single goal: to become the best dressmaker in the capital. Washington, D.C. was crowded, dirty, and dangerous, especially for a black woman trying to make her way alone. Elizabeth rented a small room and immediately started advertising her services as a seamstress. She walked the streets, handing out cards, knocking on doors, introducing herself to anyone who might need a dressmaid. The first few weeks were brutal. Nobody knew her name, nobody trusted her work, and she barely made enough money to eat. But Elizabeth had survived far worse than poverty. She had survived slavery, beatings, sexual assault, and the impossible task of buying her own freedom. A little hunger and rejection weren't going to stop her now. Slowly, women started to notice her talent. One client told another, and word began to spread that there was a black dressmaker in Washington who could sew better than the expensive white seamstresses, charging twice as much. Elizabeth's reputation grew, and soon she was being invited into the homes of senators' wives, wealthy socialites, and women with direct connections to the most powerful families in America. Then, in early 1861, everything changed. A woman named Mary Todd Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C., as the new First Lady of the United States. Mary was difficult, demanding, and obsessed with fashion. She had already gone through several dressmakers who couldn't meet her standards, and she was frustrated. Someone recommended Elizabeth Keckley, and Mary agreed to give her a chance. When Elizabeth walked into the White House for the first time, she wasn't intimidated. She had spent her life working for wealthy white women who thought they were better than her, and Mary Todd Lincoln was no different. Elizabeth measured her, listened to her complaints, and then did what she did best. She created a dress so beautiful, so perfectly fitted, that Mary was stunned. It wasn't just a dress. It was a work of art. Mary hired Elizabeth on the spot, not just as her dressmaker, but as her personal modiste, a French term that meant Elizabeth would design and create all of Mary's clothing from that point forward. Elizabeth moved into the White House as a trusted member of Mary Lincoln's inner circle. She wasn't just sewing dresses anymore. She was helping Mary get dressed every morning, sitting with her during private moments, listening to her frustrations about politics, about her husband, about the war tearing the country apart. Elizabeth became more than an employee. She became Mary's confidante, her friend, and the one person Mary felt she could trust in a city full of enemies. Elizabeth had gone from being a slave in Virginia to standing in the private quarters of the President of the United States, and she had done it entirely on her own. Elizabeth stood in rooms where history was being made, and she saw things that no one else was supposed to see. She wasn't just making dresses for Mary Todd Lincoln. She was living inside the most powerful household in America during the most violent and chaotic period in the nation's history. The Civil War was raging, and every day brought new horrors. Soldiers were dying by the thousands. The country was ripping itself apart, and inside the White House, the Lincoln family was crumbling under pressure that no family should ever have to bear. Elizabeth watched it all unfold, and she stayed silent. She dressed Mary for public events, where the First Lady had to smile and wave while her heart was breaking. She consoled Mary during private breakdowns, when the weight of being hated by half the country became too much. Southern newspapers called Mary a traitor because she was from Kentucky, a border state. Northern newspapers called her a spoiled, reckless spender who wasted money on fancy dresses while soldiers died in muddy fields. No matter what Mary did, someone hated her for it, and Elizabeth was the only person who saw how deeply that hatred cut. But the secrets Elizabeth kept went far deeper than public image. She witnessed the reality of Abraham and Mary Lincoln's marriage, and it wasn't the love story that history would later romanticize. Mary had a violent temper. She screamed at her husband in front of Elizabeth, threw objects across the room, and said cruel things that made even Elizabeth uncomfortable. President Lincoln would stand there quietly, absorbing the abuse, his face tired and sad. Elizabeth saw him walk through the White House halls late at night, alone, carrying the weight of a war that was killing hundreds of thousands of people. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he seemed to age a decade in just a few years. Mary confided in Elizabeth about things she told no one else. She admitted that she was terrified of being poor again, that she had secretly gone into debt buying expensive clothing and jewelry to maintain her image. She had spent thousands of dollars the government didn't know about, and she was panicking about what would happen if anyone found out. Elizabeth helped her hide bills, cover up purchases, and manage the lies that kept Mary's spending spree a secret. Then came the nightmare that changed everything. On April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. Elizabeth wasn't there that night, but she was summoned to the White House immediately after. When she arrived, Mary Todd Lincoln was hysterical, screaming, sobbing, and completely shattered. Elizabeth held her, dressed her in black mourning clothes, and stayed by her side through the funeral and the weeks of unbearable grief that followed. She saw Mary at her absolute lowest point, a woman who had lost her husband, her position, her sense of safety, and her mind all at once. Elizabeth watched as Mary spiraled into paranoia and depression, convinced that everyone was trying to steal from her or harm her. The government forced Mary to leave the White House, and she had nowhere to go. She was drowning in secret debts, publicly humiliated, and mentally unraveling. Elizabeth stayed loyal. She continued to visit Mary, to comfort her, to help her navigate the aftermath of losing everything. For 3 years, Elizabeth kept every secret she had learned. She never told a soul about Mary's spending, about the fights, about the breakdowns, about the private moments of weakness that would have destroyed what little was left of Mary's reputation. But staying silent was eating Elizabeth alive, and the financial pressure was crushing her too. By 1868, Elizabeth Keckley was exhausted, broke, and desperate. She had spent years loyally serving Mary Todd Lincoln, keeping her secrets, protecting her reputation, and comforting her through the darkest moments of grief. But loyalty didn't pay the bills. Mary had promised Elizabeth payment for dresses and services, but after Lincoln's assassination, those payments stopped coming. Mary claimed she had no money, that the government had left her destitute, that she was barely surviving. Elizabeth believed her at first, and continued to help without demanding payment. But as months turned into years, Elizabeth realized she had been used. She had sacrificed her own financial stability to protect a woman who no longer cared about her. Elizabeth's dressmaking business was struggling because she had spent so much time devoted to Mary instead of building her client base. She was aging, her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and younger seamstresses were taking her customers. She needed money, and she needed it desperately. Elizabeth made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She decided to write a book. Not just any book, but a tell-all memoir about her years with Mary Todd Lincoln. She titled it Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. Elizabeth convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. She believed that by telling the truth about Mary's struggles, her debts, and her mental breakdowns, she would generate sympathy for the former First Lady and help her financially. She thought people would read the book, feel sorry for Mary, and donate money to help her. Elizabeth also needed the book to succeed because she was counting on the sales to rescue her from poverty. She found a publisher who was thrilled to print such scandalous material, and in April 1868, the book hit the shelves. Elizabeth had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The book was an instant sensation, but not in the way Elizabeth had hoped. Newspapers across the country exploded with outrage. They called Elizabeth a traitor, a backstabber, and a disgrace. How dare a former slave, a black woman, publish private details about a white First Lady? The racism was blatant and vicious. White society was furious that Elizabeth had crossed a line they believed she had no right to cross. They didn't care that everything she wrote was true. They didn't care that she had been trying to help Mary. All they saw was a black woman exposing the private life of a beloved president's widow, and they crucified her for it. Mary Todd Lincoln was absolutely destroyed by the betrayal. She had trusted Elizabeth with everything, had considered her a true friend, and now that trust had been weaponized and sold to the public. Mary wrote letters calling Elizabeth a liar and a snake. She refused to ever speak to Elizabeth again, and made sure everyone in Washington society knew that Elizabeth Keckley was not to be trusted or hired. Elizabeth's dressmaking career collapsed overnight. Her wealthy clients abandoned her. Nobody wanted to hire a woman who might write a book about them next. The book itself didn't even sell well enough to save her financially because the publisher had printed it poorly, and the scandal made people too uncomfortable to buy it openly. Elizabeth had destroyed her reputation, lost her closest friend, ruined her business, and gained almost nothing in return. She realized too late that the secrets she had kept for so long were never hers to tell, and now she would pay the price for the rest of her life. After the book was published, and the backlash destroyed everything Elizabeth had built, she spent the next 4 decades living in the shadow of her own mistake. The woman who had once dressed the First Lady, who had walked the halls of the White House, who had risen from slavery to become one of the most respected dressmakers in Washington, D.C., was now a social outcast. Her name became a warning, a cautionary tale whispered among servants and workers about what happens when you betray the trust of powerful people. Elizabeth tried to rebuild her life, but the damage was too deep. Her client list never recovered. The wealthy white women who had once begged for her services now refused to acknowledge her existence. She took whatever sewing work she could find, mending clothes for working-class families, stitching simple garments for pennies when she used to charge dollars. The pride she once felt in her craft turned into bitter survival. Every stitch reminded her of what she had lost. Elizabeth moved from place to place, never able to settle anywhere comfortably. She had no savings, no property, and no family to fall back on. Her son George, the boy she had fought so hard to free, had died years earlier, in 1861, while serving in the Union Army. He had been one of the first black men to enlist, hoping to fight for the freedom of others the way his mother had fought for his. He was killed in battle in Missouri, and Elizabeth never fully recovered from losing him. She had sacrificed everything to give him a life of freedom, and he had lived only 6 years as a free man before a Confederate bullet took him away. Now, in her old age, she was completely alone. No husband, no children, no friends who hadn't turned their backs on her. The loneliness was suffocating, but worse than the loneliness was the regret. Elizabeth spent her final years replaying the decision over and over in her mind. She wondered what would have happened if she had just stayed quiet, if she had found another way to make money, if she had never written that book. She thought about Mary Todd Lincoln constantly, about the friendship they had shared, about the moments of genuine connection between two women who had both suffered in different ways. Elizabeth knew that Mary had used her, had taken advantage of her loyalty, but she also knew that Mary had been genuinely broken after Lincoln's death. Maybe Elizabeth had been wrong to expose her. Maybe the secrets should have died with her. She wrote letters trying to explain herself, trying to justify what she had done, but nobody wanted to hear it. The world had already decided who Elizabeth Keckley was, and nothing she said would change that. By the early 1900s, Elizabeth was destitute and physically failing. She had no income, no home, and no ability to work anymore. In 1892, she accepted the only option left to her. She moved into the Home for Destitute Women and Children in Washington, D.C., a charity facility for people who had nowhere else to go. She lived there for the final 15 years of her life, surrounded by strangers, forgotten by the world. On May 26, 1907, Elizabeth Keckley died at the age of 80. There was no funeral, no public mourning, no recognition of the incredible life she had lived. The woman who had been born a slave, who had bought her own freedom, who had dressed a first lady and kept the secrets of a president, died alone in a charity home with nothing to her name. She was buried in Harmony Cemetery, and for decades, her grave went unmarked. History forgot Elizabeth Keckley, just as she had feared it would. Elizabeth Keckley's life was a tragedy wrapped in triumph, wrapped in devastating loss. She accomplished things that should have been impossible for a black woman born into slavery in 1818. She survived brutality that would have broken most people. She endured beatings, sexual assault, and decades of dehumanization, yet she never stopped fighting. She bought her freedom when the odds were stacked impossibly against her. She built a business from nothing and rose to the highest levels of American society, becoming the personal confidant of a first lady during the most critical moment in the nation's history. She had everything a formerly enslaved woman could dream of: respect, financial stability, independence, and a name that meant something. But one decision, One moment of desperation and misguided judgment erased it all. The secrets she kept for Mary Todd Lincoln were never meant to be shared, and when Elizabeth finally spoke, the world punished her for daring to tell the truth. It didn't matter that she had been loyal for years. It didn't matter that she had been used and discarded. It didn't matter that everything in her book was accurate. What mattered to society was that a black woman had stepped out of her place, and they made sure she paid for it for the rest of her life. Elizabeth spent 50 years carrying the weight of those secrets, and when she finally put them down, they crushed her anyway. She died forgotten, penniless, and alone. A woman whose extraordinary story was buried along with her in an unmarked grave. History remembered Abraham Lincoln as a hero. History remembered Mary Todd Lincoln as a troubled First Lady. But Elizabeth Keckley, the woman who witnessed it all, who survived slavery and built herself into something remarkable, was erased. Her story is a reminder that even the strongest people can be destroyed by a single mistake, and that loyalty, sacrifice, and survival don't always lead to happy endings. Elizabeth Keckley deserved better, but the world she lived in was never going to give it to her. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic secret of all.